Hi, everyone. I'd like to talk to you today about value and drawing with value. This is as opposed to what we've been working on so far in class, which is all really about line work. Now we're going to add value to add another dimension to our drawings. So, what is value? Well, it's basically how light or dark something is. And we look at it on a scale from the whitest white of the white paper to black, or in the case of our drawings, the darkest mark that your drawing tool makes. And that really depends on what drawing tool you're using, what graphite, what softness graphite or charcoal that you're using. So here at the top, I have an example of a 6-point value scale that goes from number 1 being the lightest all the way up to number 6 being the darkest. And there are larger point value scales that you can use as well. It can go up to 8 or 10 or maybe even 12. But for most of the drawings in our class, a 6-point value scale is going to work just fine. And then underneath that, we have what we call a continuous tone value scale. And that basically means that these tones blend in one to the next in a continuous way rather than breaking them up into individual tones. So I want to talk to you a little bit about what we call the 6 divisions of light and shadow. So if you were to look at something, an object that's sitting in light, such as a sphere, what we see is the brightest highlight right here, which is called the highlight. And then around that highlight, it's where the light is still hitting that object. Even though the tone is no longer as white as the brightest white, this is still considered light because the light is still hitting the object right in that area. And then as you're moving around this sphere, you're moving into the shadow. This is where it starts becoming a little bit darker and you're fading away into the darkness of the shadow. But as it gets very dark right here, especially down in the bottom, we have what we call the core of the shadow, the darkest part of the shadow. As you continue around this object, to most people, they assume that it's going to keep getting darker and darker and darker. But what some people don't remember is that there is always a reflected light that pops up from the surface of whatever object it is that you're looking at. So this is the light that's reflected from the surface of the table that this object is sitting on. So it gets a little bit lighter with that reflected light. And then down at the bottom on the surface that the object is sitting on is what we call the cast shadow. It's the object casting a shadow onto the surface that it's sitting on. And we can see examples of these 6 divisions of light in different shapes as well, cubes, cylinders, and pyramids. And we'll come back to working with some of these geometric shapes later on in class. But I wanted to just take a look at how using these divisions of light can really define the edges of a shape and how it moves in space. And I want you to think about, again, going back to positive and negative space and how you put tonal values in your negative space and how that can affect what you're looking at in the positive space. So in this example, we have a sphere that has a bright light hitting it on this side, but to emphasize the brightness and whiteness of that light, you can add dark areas in the negative space, and that brings that lighted area forward, and it really makes it pop out. Now remember, we're moving away from line drawings, and we're really looking at tonal values in a way that we want to use different tones to create the shapes that we're seeing. So you don't want to see an outline defining the edge of this sphere. Think about how you can define edges of the shapes that you're drawing by tonal values, solid areas of one of these tones from your value scale, rather than the outlines that we've been working on so far. Along the same lines, notice that the darkness of the shadow here on the shadow part of the sphere can be emphasized by the lightness of the surface that it's sitting on. Oh, so here we have the next slide. I really like this one because I want you to think about how your eyes and your brain can kind of play tricks on you when you're looking at tonal values. So if you want to just hold up your fingers and block out that center line, you'll notice that if you look at the top and the bottom, the gray tones are actually exactly the same. This area and this area is the same mid-tone gray. I would say it's about a number 3 on a value scale. But your mind is telling you that the top is dark and the bottom is light because of, first of all, there are these hints saying that this is a lighted area and this is a darker area. but it also is telling you that because light is hitting it from the top, this must be darker than this, even though they are actually the same tone of gray. So watch out for your eyes and your brain playing tricks on you when you're looking at things and trying to figure out what tone you're actually looking at. So here's an example of a real life object, an apple that can be drawn with emphasis on these tonal values. It's a really nice drawing because it shows the entire range of values here from the number 1 of the brightest white light of just the paper, all the way to the number 6, the darkest shadow. I see is right over here, and I see just a little bit along the bottom there. Notice that there's no outline defining the shape of that apple, but it is just the tone, that those midtones. And notice little changes that create different depths in the object that you're looking at. We see the highlight. Oops, let's go back. We see the highlights here. We see the light. Notice that the light that's hitting the object, it's not white. It's still considered the light, but it's like a mid-tone gray. And as we move into the shadow and the core of the shadow, it gets darker and darker. And then here at the bottom, we have some really nice reflected light and a little bit of a softer reflected light in the back here. And then right here on the bottom is this cast shadow. Notice that the cast shadow, even though it's on a flat surface, is not entirely flat. It tends to be a little bit darker right along the edge of the object. It might fade away, and then the edge of the shadow is often very soft, depending on what the light is that you're using to illuminate your objects that you're drawing. Here we see a more subtle variation in the tones, but you still see everything from number 1s, the lightest lights here in the highlights, and you see just a little hint of the darkest dark right here along this cast shadow. Something that I really love about this drawing is this cast shadow that comes across here. It creates this curve, and it almost acts as a cross contour line that defines the shape of that pear that the shadow is casting across. So in this class, we are going to make drawings of drapery, and we are going to make drawings of eggs. So this is kind of perfect. We're not going to do them all at the same time. We're going to start with eggs, but I wanted to show you how nicely this person created this reflected light showing the lift of the drapery that the bowl is sitting on, and you can see that in the reflected light of the bowl that it's sitting on it. Notice how defined this egg is by the way the light is hitting here. The reflected light is coming up from here. Core of the shadow is actually on the back here and a little bit right through here, with a little bit more reflected light on this side, and then the cast shadow. So there's really a lot going on in this one object when it comes to all the tonal values that you see. Now, in our class, we are actually going to draw a smaller, simpler composition of 3 eggs, 3 white eggs on a white paper plate. And I wanted you to think about, when you make these compositions, to think about composition itself that we've talked about in class before. So this is one of those examples where it is literally the subject matter floating in the middle of a big white sheet of paper. Even though the drawing itself is really nice, take a look at some of these other compositions that really bring this image to life in a way that that other one doesn't. It really has a lot to do with zooming in closer to the eggs. You don't have to have all 3 of them shown. You don't have to show the entire plate. But look at how it activates the negative space around it, how it's using the rule of thirds. And of course, with 3 eggs, you'll be already using the rule of odds. Notice reflected light coming sometimes from the plate and sometimes from another egg. You could be looking at it from above if this is the composition that you choose. Before you start on your drawing, you're going to make some thumbnail drawings so that you can play around with different compositions. And I think if you zoom in really close, there tends to be just a more interesting visual effect as well, because you can also see things like the emphasis of this plate that sort of swirls by and goes off into the distance. Just a few more examples here. I want to point out some of the more effective ways that these are done. I think that we see like the edge of this egg along the side of this egg, and that darkness behind it is kind of defining this shape. In this case, we're seeing a little bit of shadows, but this is starting to look a little bit like an outline. Try to avoid that if you can. And if it disappears into the background, that's fine, because we'll still see that shape as an egg. This is something called Gestalt theory, where our minds will see, our eyes will see parts and sections of things, but our minds will put those parts together to complete the object that we're looking at. So for the drawing that we're working on in class, you're also going to create a value scale. There are two value scales up here at the top of the page, a 6-point value scale and a continuous tone value scale. I want that to be all on the same sheet of paper. So we're looking at an 18 by 24 sheet of drawing paper. And on that sheet of paper, you're going to have both value scales, either at the top or it could be on the side, and a drawing of the eggs. And that frame is made by one of the viewfinder frames. So we're going to be working in a smaller format again, like we did last week. I love this drawing because this person emphasized the lights and darks so much that they've created these lights and shadows that makes these eggs look almost like they're made of a chrome or some sort of shiny metal. This is another example of using the value scales and just putting them off to the side. I feel like this person is maybe not quite finished with this drawing because they started to fill in the background, which I feel like helps it look more complete, and maybe that needs just a little bit more in this background. This is such a great highlight right here. You can see these the reflected light just popping right back up and emphasizing the way the shape of that egg curves around and under. So I want to show you this short video on how to make those value scales. Let's take a look at this together. All right, so this is how you're going to make your value scales on your drawing. I want to remind you that in the video, I made my value scales in a sketchbook, but I want you to please put yours on the same paper as your egg drawing, the 18 by 24 drawing paper. And you're going to use it as a reference while you're making your egg drawing. When you're looking at the eggs, what I want you to do is find the lightest areas on the eggs, and you're going to make those your number one, the whitest white of the paper. And they're usually going to be just a few highlights here and there, very specific spots where the brightest white is showing. And then you're going to find the darkest shadows, and you're going to use number 6 on your scale for those areas. And this person used it for their background, but also you'll see some of the dark shadows of the eggs. Now keep in mind that you are drawing white eggs on a white plate with a white light shining on top of it. So you're not actually seeing anything that's black or even really super dark. What you're going to do is translate the darkest shadows that you see into number 6. And what's going to happen is by using the full value scale, you get to pull out those objects even more. It really brings the drawings to life and makes them a lot more dramatic and a lot more interesting. So that's why we use the full value scale. Even if you're not seeing it, you're translating it as the artist to make it more full and more rich of a drawing. So everything else is going to basically fall somewhere in between on your scale. You're going to keep looking at your scale and looking at the eggs that you're drawing and deciding, what are you really looking at? Does that look like a darker number 4, number 5, or is it actually more of a lighter number 2 or number 3 area? And you're just going to be almost like coloring by number in a way if you just pay attention to what you see. And it's important to try not to go too dark too fast. Sometimes it's easy to just dive in and try to color it all in, but then you end up having to erase, and it's really a lot easier just keep adding it to make it darker than to erase and pull it back. So when you're working on this drawing, just remember to take your time, take it slowly. First of all, work out the composition. Make sure that you get the thumbnails done and your composition worked out before working on the full drawing. And number 2, make sure to pay close attention to what you're seeing and let your eyes tell you what you're seeing, and try not to think too much. Like, don't let your mind get in your way, but actually draw what you see.